Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for that very kind introduction. At the outset, I want to acknowledge the leadership of Professor Mike Hardy, Director of the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at your university, Councillor Linda Bingham, who we've heard from this morning. Thank you for your good wishes for Australia at this very difficult time. And the Very Reverend John Whitcomb, Dean of this amazing cathedral. I too want to add my words of acknowledgement about what happened here on the 14th of November 1940. As you've already heard, 300 German bombers dropped 500 tonnes of explosive, 33,000 incendiary bombs and dozens of parachute mines on this city. And during the raid, 507 civilians were killed and 420 were seriously injured. Your city did respond with heroism, and of course it rebuilt, and you are the beneficiaries of that work of rebuilding today. But it would have been easy in those days to harden your heart, to focus on the hatred of the enemy. But instead, your city did a remarkable thing. It turned its face towards peace. It channeled the best of humanity and human understanding, that rather than turn away from the world and become embittered about what had happened, that you would turn outwards and seek to forge a global community in which such horrors would not happen again. On that, I truly want to congratulate you. I am full of admiration. I want to bring you a story from Australia from around the same time. In 2 air raids on the 19th of February 1942, the Second World War reached Australia's shores. 242 attack aircraft and bombers carried out a pattern of bombing of Darwin Harbour and surrounding areas. It was the start of a sustained bombing campaign by the Japanese across Australia's north, which lasted almost 2 years and killed hundreds of Australians and allies. More than 240 people alone died during the first attacks on Darwin, including civilians, post office workers and service personnel from Australia and the United States. Darwin itself endured 64 bombing raids by the Japanese over 18 months, destroying numerous civic and military buildings, boats and aircraft. Many other towns across Australia's north were also bombed by the Japanese, including Broome, where as many as 100 people lost their lives, Wyndham, Katherine, Townsville and Cairns. Despite the significance of the Second World War coming to our shores in that form, the form of bombings, all of this was downplayed at the time. In fact, most of Australia did not know what had happened. The news was suppressed for fear that our people would become deeply doubtful about the outcome of the war. Now, I invite you to imagine trying to keep something like that secret today. Impossible. But it was kept secret. It's a history that's not commonly known around the world, I think, because it started so shrouded by mystery. But I hope too that we can say about ourselves in Australia that, like you, through the experiences of the Second World War, we turned towards peace. In November 2011, I was privileged to take President Barack Obama to Darwin, where he met with survivors of those bombings. It was a very moving day, of course it was. Victory came for the Allies in World War II, and the commitment then was that humanity would never again have to face such evil and devastation, that we would work together to build a better world. And in the years in between, I believe the United Kingdom and Australia, as strong allies, have sought to do that, build a better world. But there is still much work to do, and there is no better place to turn our mind to the continuous challenge of building peace than right here in the city of Coventry. So I'm delighted to be here with you. Today I want to talk about some of the most important things in my life: education and the power of receiving it, and women in leadership and the power of women to contribute to a better world. And I want to draw on my experiences with these two topics, education and women's leadership, and talk about how I believe they are fundamental to the ecosystem of peace. And I know that is what you are specifically examining during this conference. But before I do that, I want to answer a question which may be on your minds, which is, how does a girl born in Wales end up turning up here in Coventry all of these years later as the former Australian Prime Minister? It is true, I was born in Wales and left it in 1966 as a 4-year-old. My mother, father and sister Alison and I were part of the continuing great waves of migration to Australia. My father was born in a coal mining village with, of course, one of those Welsh kind of names, Cwmgrach, the 6th of 7 children. My mother, Moira, was born in Barry, and as you know, it saw much bombing during World War II as well. My parents met in Barry when they were both working in the police force, and there began a love story which lasted for the rest of their long and happy lives. When my parents took my sister Alison and I to Australia, they brought with them their very practical Welsh values, a preparedness to work hard, the goal of ensuring that life for the next generation was one of greater opportunity, and most powerfully of all, a belief in the ability of education to transform life's chances. While Wales was fondly remembered and much celebrated in my family home, there were aspects of their childhoods that both my father and my mother wished had been different. My father, simply because of poverty, was not able to attend school beyond the age of 14. Despite having been offered a scholarship to continue, his family could not afford to have him in school. They needed him working, and so he went to work in the local shop. My mother was very unwell as a child at a time when there was no mechanism for helping bridge the interruptions to schooling which came from ill health. As a result, she drifted away from school, not completing secondary school. While both of them throughout their lives improved their own education through voracious reading and some formal courses of study, there was always a wistful sense of what if? What if we had completed school? What if we had been able to go on to university? What would that other life not lived have looked like? Consequently, burned into my sister and I from our earliest days was the sense that every day of education was one to be cherished as a privilege. At every turn, we were taught to think with ambition about our lives, to aim for a university education, to aim for a good career, to seek out and maximise the kind of opportunities that my parents had been denied. Now, given my schooling was undertaken in the 1960s and 1970s, that wasn't the ubiquitous outlook of the times. Many girls of my generation would have been taught in their family homes to think no further than being a wife and a mother as the sum total of their future, that there was no need to hit those books too hard because their working lives would be quite limited. But because of my parents' attitudes, while schooling brought me some childlike skirmishes with the question of gender, the primary school art teacher that got only the girls to clean up, the time in secondary school when they divided the boys and the girls and the boys went to study woodwork for a term and then metalwork for a term and then electronics for a term, while we girls studied cooking, sewing and my personal favourite, laundry. So come question time, if you do have an issue about a stain on a white silk shirt, I can definitely help you with that after 13 weeks of study. But despite these childlike skirmishes with the question of gender, really I grew up in an environment which was thankfully free of gender stereotypes. I did go to university, and during my second year a Conservative government proposed some major cutbacks to education. And with my family background, with my belief in education, I thought this was profoundly wrong. So I got involved in a student campaign to try and change the government's mind. And we did succeed in some things. The collective voices of that campaign did persuade the government to back down on some, but not all, of the cutbacks. And I learned in that time, second year university, that if you cared about something enough, if you raised your voice, if you were prepared to get out and campaign for it, that you could make a difference, that you could shape your community, shape your nation, potentially shape the world. And from then, I was hooked on the belief that public policy mattered. And to cut a very long story short, it was that ultimately propelled me into Australian politics and into the highest office in my land. Post-political life, I have devoted my time predominantly to working on education and women's leadership. And as I have said, I think both are vital to the ecosystem of peace. So let's turn firstly to education. In our world, as we meet today, there are 260 million children of school age who are not in school. Many of them will never go to school for a day. And hundreds of millions more will get some access to school, but it will either be for such a short period of time or to schools of such low quality that they will emerge from that unable to do the most basic reading, writing or mathematics. Effectively, they will have been denied education. The scale of this challenge is so much that if we imagine the year 2030, the number of young people on the planet at that time is predicted to be 1.8 billion. On current trends, fully half of them will emerge from their education with a skill level less than we associate with 10 years of schooling, with lower secondary school. And yet we know the jobs of the future will be jobs that require higher and higher skill levels. So it is this major challenge that the Global Partnership for Education is trying to make a contribution to resolving. We know that the picture for children in fragile and conflict-affected countries is even worse than in impoverished parts of the world generally. If you are a child who, through no fault of your own, is in a region of fragility and conflict, you are more than twice as likely to be out of school compared with countries not affected by conflict. And if you are an older child, that statistic actually increases. More than 2/3 of adolescents are likely to be out of school as a result of conflict. Can we fix this problem? Is this a challenge just too hard to imagine a solution for? Well, the good news is we can make a difference. In the countries in which GPE works, some 67 of them, and then bearing down on those countries that are affected by fragility and conflict, we have managed to increase, working with developing country partners, civil society and others, to increase the primary school completion rate from 56% in 2000 to 70% in 2016, which is the most recent information available. We've also managed to have more girls getting through school. And so over a almost 15-year period, we have seen the number of girls who get to go through primary school and complete it increase. So now the differential between boys and girls is at 74 to 88, still a large differential, but not as bad as it used to be. Those figures tell you change is possible, but we must double down if we are to bring education to every child. Now, what are the benefits of that education? Well, I think we all know from our own lives that economic benefits undoubtedly flow from education, that the way in which you can get access to the labour market changes depending on your educational qualifications. And what is true for an individual is also true for an economy. Higher educated societies have economies that are larger and more prosperous. But what's less known is some of the other benefits of education, particularly the benefits of educating a girl. If you educate a girl, the evidence clearly shows that she is less likely to contract HIV, she is less likely to marry young, she will have fewer children, her children will be more likely to be vaccinated, more likely to survive infanthood, and more likely to go to school. What is even less well known is that girls' education in particular is possibly the most cost-effective way of combating climate change. If every girl on our planet today had the benefit of a secondary school education and we know higher education levels correlate with a choice to have less children, the difference between global peak population as we're currently expecting it and that global peak population with educated girls is 2 billion people. So, whilst we are talking overwhelmingly about 2 billion people who live less carbon-intensive lives than we do, 2 billion is still a very big difference. But what I want to draw out most profoundly in this conversation about education is we know that education helps reduce conflict. It has been estimated that if you can lift across your whole society the level of education by a year, then you will reduce the risk of conflict by around 20%. More educated societies tend to find better ways of mediating differences rather than through resort to violence. And what is true within a country is true of countries as they interact with each other. Now, there's an extra element that we need to be very mindful of here. Yes, education matters, but so does opportunity matching that education. What doesn't support peace is if educated young people emerge into an economy that cannot offer them an opportunity. Then you get the phenomenon that I think we're all familiar with, where disappointed hope turns into anger, turns into despair, and can turn into violence. So, increased education levels matched with better economic prospects are one of the things that we need to be building in the ecosystem if we are to see increased levels of peace and conflict mediated in a way that makes a big difference. We know too that the inclusion of women in peace processes makes a profound difference. And to start the journey towards that, clearly a focus on girls' education is necessary. But that's not the stopping point if we are going to have women involved in peace processes. Before we talk about the way in which women help build peace processes, let's just take a moment to remember that in contemporary conflicts, women, civilians are more at risk than at other times in human history. And I am pleased to see that the United Nations, through a resolution this year, helped bust through the silence that there has tended to be around sexual assault, violence and rape during conflict. We know that sexual violence has been a feature of armed conflict throughout human history. But fortunately, what has been something that has been a closed-door secret in the past is now something that's coming to increasing public attention. When the United Nations debated its way through this resolution, in which it said that it would act and call on nation states to act, to shine a light on sexual violence in conflict, to reach out to those who need a journey of healing, to recognise the children who are the product of acts of sexual violence during war. There was a debate about the links between sexual violence and peace and security. And fortunately, that debate was resolved with near unanimity that yes, we needed to be talking about this, and yes, we needed to be acting on it. Words were spoken like healing is complete only when justice has been served, and that justice needs to be available for women who are the victims of sexual violence in war. So, if we start with women's leadership, if we recognise that women have a big stake in building peace, what do we need to do to enable women to be peacemakers? Well, if we find a way of getting women at the peacemaking table, we know that that shows better results. The Council of Foreign Relations has shown that when women are involved in peace negotiations, those negotiations and agreements are 64% less likely to fail and 35% more likely to last at least 15 years. Research from the Georgetown Institute for Peace, Women and Security shows that despite the benefits of involving women in peace processes, Women make up only 2% of mediators, 5% of witnesses and signatories, and 8% of negotiators. That's what we need to change. Now, why is that? Why do we, in the words of Milan Verveer, who served as Ambassador for Women and Girls from the United States, why do we largely shut out of negotiations that seek to end conflicts, as well as the decisions that shape post-conflict recovery, women? Why do we continue to do that? Well, I think the answer has many... Excuse me, I'll just take a little sip of water. Excuse me. With so much water available in Coventry, you would think I wouldn't have a dry mouth, but thank you for putting some here. Why do we keep shutting women out of involvement in these peace processes? Well, partly it is a reflection of the lack of women who have leadership positions. Who is around these tables? Excuse me. Thank you. Who is around these tables is often predetermined by who already holds which position. National leaders, leaders of local communities, warlords, people who are foreign ministers, people who have judicial training, legal training. And so if we don't have women coming through into those occupations, into those positions, into that power in equal numbers, then we're never going to see women around these tables at equal numbers either. So I think that takes us to a challenge that I spend a lot of my time on now, which is the challenge of how do we get more women into leadership? What do we need to do to get women in a position where they can lead equally? Well, to give you some unfortunate news of stock taking across our planet at the moment only 24% of parliamentarians are women. So less than a quarter of parliamentarians are women. And if that's the statistic for parliamentarians, then clearly the statistic for foreign ministers and ministers for defence is even less. Only 6% of heads of government and heads of state are women. Only 27% of judges. Now, if the rate of change in those statistics was, astronomical, well, we might say this is a short-term problem which will be resolved. But the World Economic Forum has told us that at current rates of change, it will be 107 years before we close the gap in political empowerment for women. 107 years. Certainly none of us will be here, but we're not even talking about achieving equality for the next generation or the generation after that, 107 years. So what can we do to change that picture, to get more women into politics, more women into occupations like law, more women in leadership positions, more women around peacemaking tables? Well, solution number one that I'm going to put to you today is I do think that quotas can play a role. Quotas are often controversial because people say they're an offence against the merit system. But if you take a step back and ask yourself the question, do you truly believe that merit is equally distributed between the sexes? And if your answer to that is yes, and you see any power structure that isn't 50% men and 50% women, then that has to be telling you that there were women of merit who should have been there but didn't get there because there are some obstacles in their way. Quotas can be one way of focusing our minds on getting rid of those obstacles. Certainly, my own personal experience is they've been tremendously powerful in Australian politics. If you go back to the early 1990s, both the Australian Labor Party, of which I am a member, and the Conservative side of politics had 14% of their national parliamentarians as women, 14%. So both were dreadful. On our side of politics, we adopted an affirmative action quota which increased over time, and if we'd had a slightly better election in May, we would have been at 50-50, 50% men, 50% women. We're very close. On the other side of politics, they didn't want to use quotas. They did use some forms of women's networking and support, but they've only inched their way forward to the mid-20% in terms of number of women. So quotas can play a role to get the system motivated for change. And I can assure you, the quality of representation that the Australian Labor Party sends to the federal parliament has been raised by having more women involved and more diversity, not lowered. Then we need to think about how we see and assess merit. Do we see and assess merit in ways that are associated with stereotypes about what leadership looks like? There is a wonderful book by an academic called Thomas Chimozo Premusic, an Argentinian academic. It's entitled "Why Do We Keep Promoting Incompetent Men and How to Fix It?" I am recommending to people that you buy yourself a copy and you ostentatiously read it in public places, on the train, in crowded environments, and see what sort of reactions you get. I think they'll be quite interesting. But he puts the case to us that we are basically culturally wired to believe that the person with a bit of swagger, the person with a lot of confidence, the person with some charisma might well be a good leader. And yet, when you academically study whether confidence and charisma are correlated with good leadership outcomes, you actually find that people who are a bit more humble, a bit more prepared to have self-doubt, consequently a bit more careful, a bit more prepared to listen to others, more prepared to think things through a second, third and fourth time, that these are actually the better leaders when it comes to assessing what their leadership is delivering. And so, are we, when we think about who we should elect as politicians, even who we should appoint as judges, are we falling for this trick of imposing male stereotypes on ourselves before we even do the selection? And then there is just the very practical question of how do we ensure that political journeys and pathways, legal journeys, work in general, can be ones in which family life is taken into account, so that women and men can better balance family life with continuing to be at work, to be able to achieve, that they're not taking family-friendly flexibilities, then when they return to work put on the sort of mummy track, which is precisely a track to nowhere, while everybody else enjoys the benefits of opportunities and promotions. Here in your politics, I met earlier in this week with Stella Creasy, who is shortly to have a baby. She will be the first female politician in the United Kingdom who has won the argument that for the period of time she takes off for maternity leave, that the system will pay for her to have a locum who attends to the kind of work duties that parliamentarians do, but she will be unable to do while she's on maternity leave, conducting constituency interviews and the like. Is a bit startling that we're here in 2019 and it's taken that long for a female parliamentarian to get that kind of support around having a child. In Australia, we did make some differences by, controversially, turning what was the non-members bar into a childcare centre. I can hear you saying only in Australia, but it's been very effective, and I promise you all of the bottles of alcohol were taken away before the doors were open for children and their carers. So there are things we know we can do that make a difference. But there are some cultural and psychological things that we've got to think about as well. This hardwired around male stereotypes isn't just about confidence and charisma. It is about us, with the whispers in the back of our brain which channel stereotypes to us. It is about us saying, we expect men to be ambitious for themselves. We expect men to be power-seeking, and we don't mark men down for that. But if we see a woman who is ambitious for her own career, if we see a woman who looks like she's power-seeking, then we do mark women down for that, because it offends against the cultural stereotype that women should be motivated by the needs of others, that women are nurturing, that they're empathetic, that they're not ambitious for self. Yale University conducted an experiment where it got men and women to present in various ways to audiences, and they tracked the way in which the audience responded. and they track the way in which an audience responded to a woman who said things like, you should vote for me because I'm the kind of person who gets things done. I might step on people's toes to do it, but I get the job done. A male candidate saying that to the audience was not marked down. When a female candidate said it to a comparable audience, Yale found that it provoked, and these are the words of Yale University, moral outrage reactions of contempt, disdain, anger, irritation, approval, disapproval, disgust, and revulsion. This action by the woman of power seeking wasn't seen to just not be on all fours with the stereotype, it was seen to be wrong. Now, I think some of those words are worth saying twice because it tells you a real story about attitudes to women and leadership. Contempt, disgust, revulsion. These are mind-bogglingly strong words. So there is a journey for all of us, for each of us, for our communities, to shine a light on how these stereotypes interplay with women and leadership and hold women back. And I think on the basis of understanding that data from Yale, perhaps it is a little easier to understand why women in public life disproportionately get the levels of abuse that they do. And this isn't, just a theoretical question to be discussed. This is an actual live question in British politics today. Already, 18 women have said that they will not contest the next election. Now, that number of retirements by women is not disproportionate to the number of retirements by men. But what is different is the early stage of their career that many of these promising women are exiting, and the fact that as they exit, they are saying the thing that is driving their exit is that they cannot take or continue to take on their family's behalf the outpouring of bile and misogyny on social media, and the fact that it doesn't just stay online, that it can spiral into threats against women, their families, their children in the real world. So if we are to have more women come through for leadership, we need to get to grips with the most deep-seated of stereotypes about women leaders. We need a journey of education in communities here and around the world. And that, in and of itself, I think, should bear the title of peacemaking, of having more civil discourse in our democracies. I think people are hungry for that they look at all of the shouting and all of the abuse and they become frustrated and they turn away, that we should have more civil discourse, which in turn would be more inclusive of women, which in turn would enable more women to come through into the corridors of power, which would make it more likely that in peace negotiations and discussions, women were represented in real numbers rather than in a token way. So how do we confront that big challenge? Well, number one, by talking about it. Number two, I believe, by calling on those who have voices and power into society to make sure that there are some morals, some norms set about discourse in public life. I said yesterday at a gathering in London, I think it would be incredibly powerful if during this British election campaign, some of Britain's leading male non-politicians, perhaps very big business identities and the like, signed a joint statement which said something to the effect of, we represent thinking across the political spectrum, we don't care at the end of the day, it's a question for British voters, whether they're going to vote Tory or Labor or Lib Dem or any other political party, it's a question for British voters what they think about Brexit. We are just coming together to say we do not conduct our democratic discussions like this. Let's get the hate and the revulsion and the gendered and misogynistic speak out of the dialogue. If we could do that, I think it would make a huge difference. Our social media companies also have a responsibility to step up here, and they still are not fully stepping up. It amazes me that I could not take an advertisement out in the Times that called for someone to be raped or killed. But I could, if I took it into my head, get my phone out of my handbag in the next hour or two and put that on Twitter. Why do we tolerate that? The difference in regulation and conduct between media platforms, particularly when we know that globally, in many parts of the world, the UK, the US, other democracies, people are getting 50% of people are getting all of their political information online. We do, when we talk about women's leadership, frequently use the snappy saying, you can't be it if you can't see it, which is to catch the concept that we can't encourage women and girls to go into occupations like politics unless they can see women leading. But we have to ask ourselves the questions, what are we role modelling now? If women and girls are looking at their political structures and seeing women leaving because of the dimensions of abuse. All of these are challenges about peace building and peacemaking, and I know that is what you are here to discuss. In terms of building an underlying support for peace, I believe in the power of education, I believe in the power of women's leadership, but more than anything else, I believe in the power of people of goodwill to come together and make a huge difference in our world. So thank you for being amongst those people of goodwill. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Prime Minister Julia.
Thank you.
For this very, very inspiring opening of today's conference. This passionate advocacy for the role of education and the role of women in building peaceful communities, really at the core of the ecosystem for peace. I don't think there could be a better introduction actually to the overall theme of this conference. And thank you also for going back to your own background, upbringing and career, because I believe that's an inspiration for many to think of that it's possible and to think of the need to create the conditions to enable many, many more others to benefit from that type of social progress that was in your personal, and that is in your personal story. I'm sure that much of what you've said resonates with the audience, yet all of us are still confronted with the key question, how to get there? What are the obstacles that we need to face and combat? What are the options? So I would like to open the floor for questions, for statements, for debate and dialogue on the way to the objective of seeing education and the role of women as the key to peace. Please. Yes. Oh, yes.
Thank you very much. Being Lord Mayor does get you some privileges. Thank you for allowing me to be first. Julia, that was absolutely enthralling. But as a person who's got a decade or so on you, although I eventually got a degree, it wasn't until my 40s because of that very attitude that you were speaking about. I'm very, very late entering politics. And I'm really interested in you speaking about the education of girls. That's so important. But we have a generation or two of capable women who've lost out on that education. I'm just about to become an ambassador for the Workers' Educational Association. So my interest is in educating older women, women who perhaps gone through motherhood, but who have so many years left of usefulness and educating those women. I just wondered whether you agreed with that.
Oh, look, I certainly do, and I think when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals that we've set our world, so the nations of the world coming together and saying we will get these 17 big things done by 2030, Sustainable Development Goal 4 is education and opportunity for all, and it specifically recognises that there should be second chances and there does need to be lifelong learning. It's got both the dimension of opportunity, people who missed out earlier, but for all of us as the world changes so quickly, it's not like we can get a dose of education when we're a child and that's going to last us the rest of our lives. Things will change too quickly, so we'll all need the opportunity to be able to go in and out through education structures. So wholeheartedly agree with what you've said.
And thank you. Thank you for also showing us your background and your inspiration. Really very, very important. I'm now going to take a number of questions or interventions, 3 at a time. Raise your hand when you want to come into the debate. Yes, there. And keep your hand up so that the other people can see you.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi,
and
good
introduce
morning.
yourself.
I will do. My name is Chris McNaught. I'm the Chief Executive of a women's organisation here in Coventry, and I absolutely loved what you had to say in your speech. Obviously, we struggle as a women-only organisation with funding, commissioning to actually provide women-only services, which is my job, and I have to do that. The biggest challenge we seem to face is the question I'm always asked, why women? Why do you need women-only services? And I think that's a real challenge that myself and other women's sector partner organisations actually face, that we're having to answer those questions. So I'd love to know from, what we can do locally that feeds into a national and international sort of perspective. How do we challenge that question, why women's spaces are important?
Very, very much to the point. Yes, thank you for that question. I saw there, and...
Good morning, I'm Peter Barnett, Head of Service for Coventry Libraries. I really enjoyed what you had to say and found it very inspirational. I wanted to pick on the point you made about social media and reflect on the fact that we can't find ways of disagreeing with each other and debating things together anymore. And obviously, as well as the point you made about Twitter, we've got the issue of fake news and how misinformation is being spread, which can be very challenging. I just wanted to ask you, obviously as a former Prime Minister, what your view is of regulation of the internet, regulation of social media. Freedom of speech is quite precious, but something is out of sync at the moment.
Thank you.
Hi, Zubayd Limbada. A question around your time in power as a Prime Minister. Was there one piece of legislation or one aspect in terms of your premiership that you feel, as a woman who's given very powerful kind of advocacy around gender, was there one thing that you couldn't do that you wished to do, but kind of something to reflect on?
Please.
I'll take them in the reverse order if I can. One of the things I do regret, we had invested in a program we called Women Shaping the Pacific because Australia, obviously, it's near Pacific neighbours, it's our region of the world. We particularly look towards our near neighbours when we're thinking about how we can support peace and development. And it was a recognition that of the parliaments of the world that tend to have no women, they are disproportionately in our region, and so Women Shaping the Pacific. And I think it was showing such promising results, it sort of staggered on in a much reduced funding format, but it really is so important for us to keep investing in women having the opportunity to shape their societies, so I do regret that. On the social media regulation, so coming over here, it's complicated and none of us want to end up in a world where government is regulating free speech, because we've seen that movie before and it doesn't end very well when governments overstep the boundary. But I think some guidance can be taken out of the comparison with traditional media. I've given you one comparison when I spoke. Let me just give you another comparison. There was a recent flurry in the United States because the Republicans put together an advertisement attacking Joe Biden, obviously wargaming that, you know, he may well be the nominee against Donald Trump. So they were starting the attack ads now. And they put together an advertisement with demonstrably false claims in it. And it had, you know, videos and print-style advertisements. And they took the video advertisement to a major television station that said, you know, under the rules of conduct that we work to, we know the claims in this advertisement are demonstrably false, so we won't put it to air. We don't put political ads to air that are just wrong. Twitter announced off this debate that it would no longer take political advertising on the platform. Facebook said, nope, we'll take the ad, we'll take that Biden ad, and we are not regulating political advertising because, you know, the consumers of Facebook can work that out, what they think is true and what they don't think is true. And it just leaves me wondering, why is it that, you know, we don't say, well, there should be the same degree of truth-telling in something that is a political advertisement on Facebook as well as other platforms? Why should you be getting different standards if you pick up, you know, the New York Times, if you look at Twitter or if you look at Facebook? And people can work it out for themselves. Like, people are smart, absolutely. But we're getting into a world where there will be data about you available that is comprehensive about who you are and what you like. Hillary Clinton, in an event I did with her yesterday, gave an example. We could work our way through Cambridge Analytica, and people like that could work their way through all of your online presence, and they could work out you're a dog owner and a dog lover, and that's a big motivator for you. And they could get an advertisement of a politician where they've clipped words from different speeches, put them together in such a sophisticated way you would not be able to tell viewing it that it was a fake, and they could have that political candidate say, I hate dogs. And so you're like, I'm a dog lover. Well, that candidate hates dogs. Okay. Like, why are you supposed to look at that and decode the fake? You probably won't be able to as this technology gets more and more sophisticated. So the regulation around what goes up is really important. And I think what we're prepared to do in print is a good guide. Coming to the question of women's only spaces, I'm a big believer that if we are to get the profound changes we need in gender equality, we need both men and women involved. But there is still a role for women to come together as women in women-only spaces. And if I was just going to quickly give one argument for that, it would be that the evidence clearly shows that when there are conversations in mixed groups, disproportionately, men dominate those conversations and think they don't. There's actually been all sorts of psychological studies. I'll probably get the figures wrong, but it's something like, if you have 20 women at a meeting of 100 people, the men, when surveyed, will say there was a lot of women there. And if there are 50% women at a 100-person meeting, the men will say it was disproportionately women. So until we can correct some of that, I do think we need our safe spaces to come together.
I think there's a disproportionate amount of women around here. Who would... Yes, please.
Good morning, Julian. My name is Ram. I'm one of the local councillors. Just put that in order. Your speech actually took me back to my own childhood. I was born in slums, what people called the untouchables in India. So I'm just thinking that your education for children and the women, because I'm just flipped back in India. How I know you are an international politician, so you understand those things better than many of us. There are children, millions and millions of children in India, which, like me, are born in slums, and their system is such. Although there is an issue called reservation for those communities. But that doesn't reach to them. the children, especially women, they are more victim of the system, of whether it's called caste system, whether it's capitalist system. I'm trying to understand how that your part of quota can fit in that side, where millions of children and the women can be helped to get up to some degree to close enough, not necessarily going up that much. Perhaps at least they can start somewhere. I just thought that is a very relevant point with your quota system.
Sure.
Wait a minute, please.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I just first wanted to say thank you. My name is Jessica Northey. I'm the director of our PhD programme here in the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. Thank you for your support and understanding and recognition of the situation in UK politics right now and the difficulties for women and for young women and young people more widely to get involved in politics and what has become such a hostile political environment. And I think this is really important conversations that we all need to be having, and thank you for your contribution to that. My question was more widely on the topic of education in particular. I mean, the argument about population is always incredibly complicated and difficult one to have, but it's not just about potentially reducing the number of children that women have, but also the transition within societies such as our own, the UK and Australia, which are incredibly high in carbon intensive societies, as you mentioned. How do you think women play a role in the kind of transitional educational reforms that we'll need to see in the next decade to transform our societies if we want to survive as humanity? And women such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US, Greta Thunberg in Sweden, are at the forefront and are taking an enormous amount of hatred and bile online. How do we support these young women and older women who are bravely trying to take on these transformational moves? And is it in the education sector that we can do that? Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Good morning. My name's Naomi. I'm the community reporter from Coventry Telegraph, which is our local paper. So thank you for coming today.
Speak a bit in the microphone, please. Yes.
Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yeah, that's great.
My question is on education. Much like the national picture, Coventry schools are getting continued budget cuts. At the moment, Coventry pupils are getting £74 less per head in 2019 to 2020 than the previous year's money. So my question would be, how can our local schools navigate these barriers, particularly very basic practical barriers, to create leaders and to help the younger generation that you mentioned get into positions of leadership?
Sure.
Please.
Well, I'll sort of take these two questions together and then come back to the question about India. You know, I'm not an expert in the funding and structures of your education system. I know a fair bit about Australia, but what I do know is that quality education is a powerful combination of the right resources and the right ways of working, the right ways of teacher training and support. And if you are in a disadvantaged community, or a community that might have levels of advantage and disadvantage, disadvantaged kids can get a great education too, but it requires more resourcing. And so we don't give kids a fair chance if we use mechanisms. Just excuse me, I'm going to have to do another little slurp. We don't give kids a fair chance if we just use very blunt mechanisms and say, you know, we'll put X amount of money for every child's education. We've got to be sensitive to context and difference, and then by differentially resourcing, we can meet needs and have every child come through. On the transformational leadership, I don't think men and women are born with inherently different leadership styles. I think it's learned. And it's socialised, and it starts from the moment that a young man or a young boy who's getting the kids in the street to play is viewed as a little leader, and a young girl who's doing that is viewed as a Miss Bossy Boots. You know, right from that moment, we start stereotyping different visions of leadership. I think it is possible for a man to be an empathetic, nurturing leader. I think it's possible for a woman to be a command and control leader. But it is true in today's society, having had the cultural stereotypes in play that we do, that women are more likely to show leadership that is putting the team first, that has a more empathetic style, that is more enabling to those around. And I actually think that style of leadership is what the world is increasingly looking for. Yes, there are still times when you need command and control leaders. In absolute emergencies, you need one leader who is saying, do this, don't do that, you must go and do this now. If you're fighting a bushfire in Australia, or if you're dealing with something that's a critical incident, command and control leadership comes to the fore. But overwhelmingly, day to day, the leadership people are looking for in their working lives, their communities, is this more enabling style of leadership. And so I think this is a good moment to be talking about that and empowering the people who show that. On India and the question of quotas, there was actually a fantastic social experiment done in India, where at the local leadership level, for a period of time, for a set number of communities, there was a rule which said the only people who can come through to be a local leader are women. So they just did it at a limited number of villages, local leadership, the leader must be a woman. So really a very blunt, comprehensive form of quota. Would be the equivalent of saying here that you could only be Lord Mayor of Coventry if you were a woman. Men need not apply. You can imagine not everybody was happy with this, but it did enable researchers to do a comparative study. And once you had that shock to the system of you must have women leaders, actually when they went back to the usual system where leadership could be male or female, they found that more women came through, because through that, moment, you'd got the idea in people's heads that women can be leaders, women can be good leaders. Girls thought to themselves, I could be a leader when I grow up. And so you got more women coming forward to participate in the system than had when historically male leadership was the model. And in the villages where this sort of sharp shock wasn't done, it just went on as business as usual, disproportionately male leadership. So it tells me even in villages in India where you are dealing with profound challenges about poverty and opportunity, that this thinking about quotas and structural changes to the system can be very powerful.
Thank you very much. Allow me to ask you one question that is in my mind already for years. 20 years ago. Oh, don't worry.
This is going to be a hard one.
Don't worry. I'm not going to ask you about your laundry hang-up. Don't worry. So about 20 years ago, there was the Education for All campaign organized by the UN in the framework of the Millennium Development Goals. Now we are with the Sustainable Development Goals. What are you seeing in terms of the progress that we're making to make education for all reality for all boys and girls?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's a great question. The Millennium Development Goal era, so the goals struck in 2000 for the 15 years for education, had as the goal universal access to primary school education. It was an access measure. And with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, which is a wonderful thing to have, just having an access measure didn't really help because many countries said, okay, we need to acquit the Millennium Development Goal. The way we will do that is we will abolish fees for schools so every child can come. So that sounds good, every child can come. But then the fee money went out of the education system and no more new money went into the education system. And so you had classes that used to teach 50 kids now teaching 150 kids with 10 books for all of the kids, and no one was learning. And so we from that era, in striking the Sustainable Development Goals, the emphasis has gone on access and quality. We need to be increasing both. There's no point having kids sit in something that's labelled a school if they're not learning anything. And that is driving a set of behaviours now where there is increased energy and innovation around how we can strengthen education systems, and the Global Partnership for Education does that. We can show results, we can show increasing access, and in some places we can show increasing quality. But in all of that, I don't want to pretend to you we have solved this problem. If we are not on track, we are nowhere near on track to achieve education for every child, a quality education for every child by 2030. That is going to take more innovation, more new thinking, more people coming to the table, and profoundly, it's going to take more resources.
Well, thank you so much. That's really also something in creating the ecosystem for peace that needs to be top of the agenda, just like your remarks on the role of leadership, the role of women, and education as a necessary condition for that will continue to resonate also during the conference. It's really at the heart of the ecosystem for peace. So thank you very much for a very, very inspiring presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for the discussion.
Thank you. Thanks.